Saan nyo ko na hanapin yung halaman na kakaibang halaman. Kailangan natin mahanap yun. Ito guys. Ito guys. Alam nyo ba yung halaman na yan? Alam nyo kung anong tawag dyan? Marami pala ito rito. Guys. Napakalaga ng halaman na to. Sa status ito guys. Medyo pakikinabahan na to ng tao. Medyo limitado lang na nakakaalam yan. Guys, yan. Yan ang itsura niyan. Baka meron sa inyo yan. Guys, babalikan natin yan after 1 week. So, guys, babalikan natin yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na puno. Tignan natin kung may nahinog na. Ayan guys, ayan guys. Guys, ayan na. Namumunga na siya guys. Ito yung sinasabi ko sa inyo guys. Ito yung napakalagang puno. Puno na magbibigay sa inyo ng kaginhawaan. So guys, bukas babalikan natin yan. Tara guys, balikan natin uli yung nakita natin kagabi. Baka mas lalong nahinog na. Eh yung sinasabi ko sa inyo na kakaibang puno. Tara, samahan nyo ako. Guys, medyo mahirap hanapin yung puno na yun pero kailangan natin tiyagain. Ayun guys. Ayun guys, nakita nyo? Nahinog na. Ayan guys. Guys. Nahinog na siya guys. Nakita nyo yan? Sinasabi ko sa inyo guys. Babalikan uli natin yan after mga 2 days para mas hinog na hinog. Kumbaga overripe. Tignan natin kung ano yung magiging resulta guys. So guys, sana babalikan natin at wala makakita. So samahan nyo ako kung paano natin siya makita na yung hinog na hinog. So guys, balikan natin yan after 2 days. Gabi natin kukunin para wala tayong kasama at walang makakita. Walang mga idea na mayroong ganitong puno dito sa loob. So guys, balikan natin yung sinasabi ko na sobrang hinog na siguro yun. Guys, ayun na. Nakikita ko na guys. Yes! Yes! Guys, nakikita nyo ba guys? Kukunin ko lang guys ha. Hinog na guys. Guys, samahan nyo sa pagpitas. Okay. Thank you sa'yo ah. Grabe. Sana mamuha pa susunod. Sana mamuha pa susunod. Thank you guys. Thank you guys. Thank you. Wala na ba guys? Check natin guys. Baka meron pa. Salamat sa'yo ha. Ito ang tunay na man-tree kung tawagin. Ito ba? Sangkot. Guys. Wala na. Wala na. Ito mamumuho na to. Mga 2 weeks pa to. Kahit ma-extend pa ang ECQ, survive kami. Sa dami ng bunga. Salamat sa iyo, Money Tree. Maraming salamat.
Two 2,000 years later, 6.5 hours later, a few inches later, day 2, day 3, day 4, a few moments later, 1 eternity later, 3 days later, 12 seconds later, 3:28 a.m. 3 weeks later, many months later.
So much later that the old narrator got tired of waiting and they had to hire a new one.
Tomorrow for sure. Eventually, 12 o'clock midnight. 1 hour later, 2 hours later, 3 hours later. While Patchy pulls himself together, let's see how SpongeBob's party is shaping up. Meanwhile, 2 hours later, 8:01 p.m. The next day. Later, 20 minutes later, 6 hours later, several bad puns later.
70 years later.
Meanwhile, 6 hours later. Later that same evening, several days later. 6 months later. 2 hours later. 1 minute, 37 seconds later. 1 debt to society later. 4 to 6 weeks later. 1 pair of pants later. 8 hours later. 298 frozen patties later. 3 hours later. Epilogue. The next day, 10 seconds later, 346 minutes later, much later. Meanwhile, at the Krusty Krab, 3 days later, opening night later, 3,000 years later. 1 week later, 7:59 a.m. 3 weeks later, 3 days later, 2 hours later, 2 hours later, 48 hours later, 8 hours later. The following Thursday, 5 minutes later, 24 hours later, much later, much later, 7 hours later, epilogue. Several song-filled hours later, a few minutes later, a little longer than a few minutes later, 2 hours later, 3 days later, 15 minutes later, several months later, thousands of tears later, 16 paranoia-filled days later, 2 hours later, much later, yesterday, many hours later, 75 years later, 2 hours later, 1 extremely annoying shift later, 2 very boring minutes later, 3 hours later, 1 winner later, the following day, meanwhile, later, just then. What follows is a brief construction montage. We hope you enjoyed this brief construction montage.